In this tutorial, we're going to composite our final Batman vs. Superman titles sequence movie. Now I've gone in and I've created a new composition called Final Movie. Prior to that, I lined up and numbered all the sequences which will comprise our final movie. So I've gone in and I've dragged them in order in my composition window below, and any of the ones I don't need now that have helped me compose some of the components here, I'm going to close out. So in this instance, I don't need this Batman animation sequence, so I'll just close that out. Now if you wanted to, you could drag the order in which you would want these compositions to appear in the main comp window by simply dragging left or right. So I've gone in and I've put them in the order in which they were created. And a couple of reasons why you would use multiple compositions to make a single movie. One would be that if each of these sequences, I'm on intro 1 and it's comprised of 6 layers. So if each of these were composed of 6 layers or more, you would have some 30-odd layers in your composition layer window below, which means you would have to minimize your movie window in order to work with those layers. The other reason is just for the narrative. It'll help you organize how you're going to approach this project. Now that I've got the final movie created, I've gone in and dragged all these sequences into my timeline and have lined them up against the left-hand side of the composition layer window. I want to separate these out in equal intervals of 14 seconds. So I'm going to select, I'm starting by selecting intro, and then I'll shift select the end layer, which is number 6. And then I'm going to go to animation, keyframe assistant, sequence layers, and I'm going to overlap them. If you recall, we chose 2 seconds as an interval for transitions from one composition to the next. So once I've checked off on overlap, under duration I'll put 200, and I'll hit return, and it's separated out those sequences with 2-second transition areas at the end of each top layer. Now that we've got our sequences lined up top to bottom like a descending stairway, we're going to put our transitions between these. The transitions always go on the clip above the one that it's transitioning into. So in this case, the intro tab will transition down to the Batman tab, number 2. I'm going to select the intro tab because it's the top layer and that's where the transition will go. I'm putting the playback head halfway between where the intro sequence ends and the Batman sequence begins right here. So with the top one selected, I'm going to go to Effects, Transitions, and I'm going to choose the linear wipe for this. And when I introduce it, it will show up in the upper left-hand corner where the project tab had been previously. So I will open that up, and you'll see that it says Transition Completion, and it'll be set to 0. Once I've put that on, I'm going to drag on transition completion to about 50%, and it'll give you an idea of how that transition is going to behave before we actually drop the keyframes to do it in time. So I'll put my transition about there, and then you can see that the angle can be changed. As long as there's a diagonal, that is perfectly fine. We always avoid horizontals and perfect verticals in the context of any sort of design because we're already limited by the static shape of rectangle that any digital composition is limited by. So once I've got the angle that I'm alright with, I'm going to put the playback head at the beginning of clip number 2. That will show once this wipes and reveals it. I'll return the transition completion back to 0, set the first keyframe. I'll put the playback head now at the end of sequence number 1, and I'll make the transition completion 100%. So now if I was to play through that area, the top clip is hidden by the transition, revealing the second clip below. Now we added one other thing to this, and that was a drop shadow. And the drop shadow was added to add a little dimension and depth so it didn't look so flat between clip number 1 and clip number 2. So I'll go to Effects, and going to Perspective, and then Drop Shadow. I'm opening up the Drop Shadow tab, and in here I can direct where I would like the drop shadow to go. I'm dialing this drop shadow so that it is above where our wipe goes. And here it's a matter of your own choice, but I could make it darker, I could make it lighter, I could change the softness of it, I could increase the distance. So you want to kind of do this so there's a bit of translucence to it anyway. Now that we have that transition in, let's go and put another one in between Batman 2 and then Superman 3 below. I'll place the playback head halfway between where the clip number 2 ends and clip number 3 begins. I'm selecting clip number 2 because it's above the 1, 3, the one that number 3 is the one it's transitioning into. With it halfway between, I'll go to Effects, again I'll go to Transitions, and I'm going to throw the block dissolve on. Now, this tutorial with using dissolves like the block dissolve and the wipe, you really have to be careful because they become pretty tasteless and start to look like a wedding video. You'll notice that really good editing is defined by not being able to notice the transitions because it interferes with the narrative. So this tutorial is simply to show you how these things work. Once I've put the block dissolve in, you'll see there are a number of features we can edit here. But there is one of the common elements to most of the transitions are transition completion. So I'm going to go to transition completion and I'll just drag it to about 50% and I can see the effect that this transition will have. Now I'm going to leave it at about 50 or so. Then I'll make the changes to the size of the blocks and any other features I want to play with inside this transition. And once I've done that, I'll put my playback head at the beginning of the clip below the one we'll be transitioning to. And I'll set the transition completion to 0, drop my first keyframe, put the playback head at the end of the clip that'll be leaving screen, and make the transition 100%. Now in this next transition, going from clip 3 to 4, I'm going to use a simple fade. And the subject matter you choose to do the titles on will kind of dictate what transitions to use. But more often than not, transitioning with opacity is the less intrusive and obvious way to do it. Transitions are distractions that detract from the content that we're trying to convey. So I've opened up my opacity by hitting T for clip number 3, and I've put my playback head where clip number 4 begins, and I've dropped my first keyframe for opacity, leaving it at 100%. I'll go to the end of that clip and I'll drop the opacity to 0. So if I was to play through that, there's a clean transition from one clip to the other. I'm going to leave now and then introduce transitions for the remaining sequences here. And then when we return, we'll composite, put our audio file in, and export our final movie. I've completed all my transitions between these sequences. Now it's time to put the audio file in. I've imported the Batman MP3 file into my project window, and I'm going to select it and drag it onto screen. I'll go down to the bottom and I'll open up the triangles for audio and then waveform. And I'm going to put a fade in on that audio waveform. I'll go to the beginning of my timeline. I'll drop the first keyframe for audio levels. I'll make the blue zeros a -100, and I'll move 2 seconds in time, and I'll return the audio levels to 0. And now I have got a fade in on my audio file. I'm now going to go to the end of the composition. At the end of the composition, I'm going to make the zeros once again a -100. I'll move back in time 2 seconds, and I'll return the audio levels to 0. So now we've got a fade in, fade out for our audio file. So the next thing I want to do is I want the entire composition visually to fade out at the same time interval that the music does. So I'm going to create a blank black layer to put it on the top of everything. I'll go up to Layer, New, Solid, and I'll choose black. Click OK. And I'm putting my playback head at the 3rd keyframe for the audio file, which in this case is at 48 seconds for me. And there I'm going to clip that black layer by holding down the Option key and hitting the open bracket. Now at this point in time, the opacity should be 0. So I'll hit T to open up the transparency layer. I'll drop the first keyframe for opacity, 0 it out, proceed to the last keyframe for my audio, and make the opacity 100% again. So we've got a fade out for the video as well as the audio under the same time sequence, that last 2 seconds of our composition. Now going to export the final movie using the media encoder. I've set the in and out points for my work area bar right below the timeline. And with the timeline selected, I'm going to go to File, and I'm going to go to Export and to Media Encoder. And once Media Encoder loads, I'll see my composition represented in the upper right hand corner window of the media encoder. Now that it's appeared in the upper right hand corner, I'm going to click on the blue H.264. The dynamic link will show me a preview of the movie that I wish to export, so I can confirm the in and out point and the content. So I could play through or drag through, or I could edit the in and out point here as well. Now I'm going to click on Final Movie next to Output Name, and I'll direct that to my desktop. Save it on your hard drive. And then down below where the basic video settings appear, we're going to index this down. In the instance of the tutorial, we drop the size down to 320 with the width, and we let the height fall where the height would relationship to the aspect ratio. We also change the frame rate, and we drop that down to 10. In doing so, we can make a much smaller file, and it can be emailed to me at my Gmail account. Once I've got the frame rate and the aspect ratio changed, I'll click OK. And then inside of Media Encoder, I will click on the little green triangle to generate that compressed final movie.